Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
Ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
Yes, I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today. Because today we are continuing our deep dive into the Kingkiller Chronicles with The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This is a relatively new venture for us, a format for us, where we're talking about a particular book in these short chapter clusters so that we could have a deeper discussion, a more focused discussion, and also get fully into the spoilers. Isn't that right, Dylan?
That's exactly right. So, in this format, we're just going to go no holds barred, full spoilers allowed for the Kingkiller Chronicle. And what that means is, if you haven't yet read the Kingkiller Chronicle, now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones, because this is a very special format for us to be revisiting a book and be able to talk about future books in the series. We don't typically have that chance. So, Charles, we got some meaty stuff from a theorizing standpoint going on at the start of this set of chapters, which is chapter 11 through 15 of The Name of the Wind. It is. I kind of referenced it a little bit in our last recording, but I was like, we should get into a little bit more in our episode that we are recording right now. What I'm referring to is this stuff about Lady Lackless. This is a nursery rhyme that Kvothe sings that he overheard, and it references a character, Lady Lackless, who is theorized by many to be actually Kvothe's mom. So it's interesting. I'll read the nursery rhyme shortly. Charles, you and I, we don't pride ourselves as being like Kingkiller Chronicle theorists or anything.
Right.
Like, we probably can't offer like.
We don't have any juicy predictions for Doors of Stone or anything, but it is interesting to see what Rothfuss is cooking up as early as chapter 11 in, the first book of the series.
Yeah, so we'll do our best, but again, people have read this book like 10 times and are throwing things against the wall that we wouldn't have thought of. But let's go with this nursery rhyme and talk from there. It's 7 things has Lady Lackless, keeps them underneath her black dress. 1, a ring that's not for wearing. 1, a sharp word not for swearing. Right beside her husband's candle, there's a door without a handle. In a box, no lid or locks. Lackless keeps her husband's rocks. There's a secret she's been keeping. She's been dreaming and not sleeping. On a road that's not for traveling. Lackless likes her riddle raveling. So he sings that, and his mom hears that, and she is pissed. And
I mean, you can understand it. It's like kind of, when you look at the double entendre of some of these words, you're like, whoa, this is a pretty vulgar poem for a preteen to be knowledgeable of.
Right. And, we get reminded about 20 times that Kvothe is precocious. He is so beyond his years, and it's still something that it would make a lot of sense that a mother would just in general be like, I don't like that you're singing that. But then again, and it's easy. This is the beauty of Rothfuss's writing, is it's so easy the first time you read it to be like, oh, this is a mom being mad and punishing her son because he sang a what's the word? Ribald. I think that's how it's pronounced. Yeah.
Okay.
So a ribald nursery rhyme. And that is a totally fair thing that happens all the time. And it's only once you've read through this whole series with a keen eye that you can then reflect on this nursery rhyme and be like, wait, there's a lot of reason to believe that this Lady Lackless character is Quothe's mom, and he's singing this crass rhyme with
and
her right
she's
there.
telling
no
him,
wonder she's pissed.
Stop singing that, for a second hidden reason that we wouldn't realize on the first pass through, right? The main reason is obviously like, hey, the poem is obviously like is loaded with like sexual innuendos, and it's just not something that a parent would not want their child singing anyway. When you talk about keeping your husband's rocks in a box with no lid or locks, it's like, okay, like that's it's like you have no idea what you're saying. Like, where did you hear that? But then also the implication of this very popular theory that he could be singing about her as well, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, it's totally wild. And I've been rereading this freaking poem or nursery rhyme, I should say, over and over again, trying to figure out, having read this a few times, this series, trying to figure out like what is being referred to here. Besides, obviously, I've been able to discern what the husband's rocks might be referring to. But when it comes to the rest of it, like this 7 things has Lady Lackless, keeps them underneath her black dress. Like, so the significance of 7, which is something that's explained in this series of chapters, the biggest thing that comes to mind is the Chandrian, right? Ben explains that basically Chandrian translates from a different language to like 7 of them. Does that have anything to do with this? I don't know. And then when it comes to all these, like, a ring not for wearing, a sharp word not for swearing, all that kind of stuff, I'm like, I don't really know what's going on here.
Right. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like cryptic enough to have intrigue, but like vague enough where it could mean anything, and it could be turned into any possible hook later on, and you could say like, hey, I planned this from the beginning, but it's like it's impossible to tell. It's like a vague prophecy where it's like, ooh, look, it came true eventually. It's like, yeah, okay, but I'm not sure if we're meant to draw too much from this.
Yeah, so you think it's just like the only significant thing from the rhyme is that like Quothe's mom is Lady Lackless, and this is like a lewd rhyme that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some prophetic stuff in here, and we know there's that other song about the lackless door later on in the series about like something about like the doors and tight held things, and I will have to pull up that poem in a bit, but 7 things stand before the lackless door or something like that, and it's like, okay, well there's more to this, but what I find most interesting is in this scene is the mom's response. And she's like she says it's not a nice thing to be singing. Have you stopped to think about what it's about? And he admittedly is like, I hadn't. I was just singing it because it was a catchy tune that I overheard. And then he only realizes afterwards the obvious sexual innuendos. And then she's like, you should always think about what you're singing. And then he goes, but how's it different from the other lewd songs that we sing all the time? And then she goes, first she tries to distract him. It's like, you tell me what the difference is. Go fetch me this. Go fetch me that. Like, clearly trying to like distract him and deflect him. But the main difference is, she says, the difference is between saying something to a person and saying something about a person. The first might be rude, but the second is always gossip. Also, Lady Perial, Perial, which is he's like referencing this
Yes,
other
like the
sexual
made-up.
song, is just a character. Lady Lackless is a real person with feelings that can be hurt. She looked up at me. And he goes, oh, I didn't know. And she goes, it's nothing to cry over, sweet one. Just remember to always think about what you're doing. And then she goes, I imagine you could make it up to both Lady Lackless and myself if you found some sweet nettle for the pot tonight, which is kind of like a...
Clever.
If this is true, and she's talking about herself, it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek way of her just being like, kind of in that moment being like, yeah, I'm Lady Lackless, and you could make it up to both of us by just stop being annoying and stop singing that song. You know, it's kind of just a clever play on words if it's true, and it could also not be true, and she could just say Lady Lackless won't care, but then it's like, how would you know unless you were her? The thing.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm glad you pointed that out, Charles. And yeah, the thing about a box no lid or locked, like that's a thing that there's the Lackless box that I believe she took with her, which I guess could be the box that Kvothe still has. What's in it? Who knows? That Kvothe has in the larger story, the frame story, but there's just so little to go off of right now that I looked up some theorizing about it. Some people are connecting. I just looked it up now, kind of. Some people are connecting the seven things to the Chandrian. But again, I don't think there's so much to go off of there. And some people think that she's being like unfaithful is what I don't really see that. There's just not a lot that I can really make of it. So we have done our best here.
Right.
And I think that it's...
I think there's definitely strong indication that Kvothe's mom is Lady Lackless. Like, even in the dialogue, she's being like, I imagine you'd be doing right by her and me if you were to just leave right now. It's one of those things that I didn't realize in the first pass, and this is the first time I'm reading it with that theory in mind from the beginning, and I'm like, oh, there's clues and signs here that are more direct than I previously thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has become one of those things that happens with books that are out forever and beloved by lots of people that have not had the final book in the series published, where it's almost just taken for granted by the fan base that this theory is true. And I would compare it to, I'm trying to remember the actual letters of it, is like R plus A equals J or whatever from the Song of Ice and Fire series, like Game of Thrones books. It's like everyone had figured that out by the time, like, it still hasn't happened in the books, but it has happened in the show. And I won't give more details because even though I'm sure probably the majority of people listening have watched Game of Thrones at least or read the books, I'm not going to spoil anything, but the big reveal that happened about a certain character's, I'll just say ancestry, how about that everyone kind of figured out beforehand, and it was right. I think the Lady Lackless reveal is in that similar boat of like, it's so, once you've read it, you see so many hints like this that it's like, all right, this is part.
And also, it's one of those things like, is it really going to be an earth-shaking revelation to the overall plot of the Kingkiller Chronicles? It's versus the Game of Thrones one, like,
that's fair.
It's interesting, but we'll see. But yeah, it's funny to see some of these theories like come to life early on in the series, and this one is pretty much all but inevitability. Unless Rothfuss is like, I don't like people predicting all this, I'm gonna change it, which he could. It's probably a similar boat that George is in. It can be kind of deflating when people predict something you've been planning but haven't written yet, and you're like, I still have to write it. God.
Yeah, I do feel that way, and I wonder if that can be part of the reason why these books end up taking longer is because it's like those are sometimes they're big reveals. They're supposed to be like these gasp moments when they happen. Like I think especially the one I mentioned in A Song of Ice and Fire, that was supposed to be like the holy crap, like, and look at all the foreshadowing that I now figured out in retrospect. But when you take forever to publish a next book and people are speculating, certain things become super obvious that if you could just like wipe all the theorizing away and a typical reader has gone through all of the books straight through, like you'd have to be amazingly perceptive to figure out. Right. But now everyone's figured out. So it's like, it's just so tough. And those are the big moments sometimes that a book's like entertainment value can depend on. And then
and how could it not affect the writing process and affect the author? Like the meta aspect of knowing where your audience is at and their relationship with your stories of like, okay, these books have been read and analyzed and people have done chapter by chapter podcast discussions like, for 10 years now. How could that not affect the final book? I can't see it, but for now, like it could still go any way. It's just some of these things coming together are relatively interesting. Another like bit of foreshadowing lore that we get if we're ready to move on is we get this conversation in chapter 12, Puzzle Pieces Fitting, around the Chandrian, and we hear more about Kvothe's father and his research into the Chandrian, which, as we know, at doing this second read and a deep dive, is like the precursor to what attracts the Chandrian to their troop and brings all this devastation to their troop. So this is the beginnings of like he's stumbling into truths that are going to eventually get him killed.
Yep. I mean, it's interesting. There's a part where Ben is bringing up some, I really enjoyed, I'll see if I can find it, where like Ben, who is viewed as this like learned man, he'd gone to university, and I would say, Kvothe's parents are surprised to see him being superstitious about the Chandrian, when it's like the kind of thing that they assume is more like, in rural areas where people spread all these legends, like that's where people are afraid. But Ben, I mean, to quote the great Michael Scott, I don't know if he's superstitious, but he's at least a little stitious about about the Chandrian. And the place he comes from is like, okay, so everyone is afraid of the Chandrian everywhere. So yes, you might not believe in them in the way that you like all of these stories are authentic or that whatever, but he's like, okay, what if you were hearing all these folks talking about like a shambleman, like totally like shamblemen being in the forest and they're scared of it. It's like, what if one person told you? What if half of a town is all warning you against it? Well, yeah, you might not believe in these mythical shamblemen, but you should have the good sense to know, don't go into the forest because there's something that's scaring all of these people. And I don't know, I just thought it was a really interesting way of phrasing it and framing it that I think is like, it's one of those things you appreciate, where a lot of authors would stop at like, okay, if everyone's scared of something, there's reason to be scared of it. And that's enough to get across the point. But I just love how Rothfuss takes his time to like have this very authentic conversation that is like kind of interesting way of thinking about it.
Absolutely. And when you go back to one of the main themes of this book, which is kind of like what makes an authentic story that people can connect with, it's not necessarily the straight facts all the time. So this is kind of a building on his thing of like, where do stories stem from, and like how do stories grow and evolve over time, and what causes these changes? it's even Kvothe in the beginning of the story when he was talking to Chronicler, he was like, well, I need to tell this story my way, and he's very adamant about that. And he's not necessarily saying because he needs to get the facts straight. He's saying it's because he wants to control the narrative and the emotion that people walk away with. And so when Ben is having this conversation with Kvothe's parents, it's this matter of like, look, you can doubt the superstitious nature of this, but it's stemming from something. And then that's couched in the conversation of Kvothe's father researching the Chandrian and being like, I'm trying to peel back the layers and get to the truth of these stories. And you know that he's working his way from like the Lanre, the Lanre, L-A-N-R-E, Lanre. So it's like he's looking at those histories. And we know later on when we get to the level of, well, maybe the Chandrian aren't even the bad guys is a hypothesis that's presented way later. We're getting prepped for that now of like, there's a reason why where Kvothe comes from, the Chandrian are bad, and where other people come from, they may not be. And getting to the heart of some of these matters is clearly striking a nerve with the Chandrian, and it will eventually be Kvothe's father's downfall. But it's this idea of like, these stories are a mask for something, or are coming from a true place. And as we get closer to that truth, things start to happen. So this idea of storytelling in general and the power behind storytelling, this is kind of honest conversation about that.
I love that connection you made to the larger themes about storytelling. Kind of makes me think that one of the things that Rothfuss believes, and is perhaps one of the themes of the Kingkiller Chronicle, is that every myth has at least a shred of truth to it, and every truth has at least a shred of myth to it. And I think the Chandrian is more in the former category, but then
so the shred of truth of that monster in the woods is probably, hey, there's something like a wild beast or bandits or something killing people that go in there, but you still wouldn't go in there, right? You still wouldn't go in there even if you didn't know what really was there. You don't need to know. You know the story of people go and they don't come out. Whether it's a mythical creature or a bandit, does it really matter? Like, you're still not going in there, is Ben's point.
Right. And then you think of something about every true story having a shred of myth. I mean, that's very clearly like Kvothe's story, and he pretty explicitly mentions, like, I am a myth in a lot of ways. So it's, I think, much like we have Kvothe's father trying to parse out the truth in this myth, we also have the task of parsing out the myth in Kvothe's truth that he is presenting, and that's the whole unreliable narrator aspect to Kvothe controlling the narrative. And very, very interesting stuff to be thinking through, and that's a good thought there, Charles, about connecting it to a larger theme about story.
Right, and then his dad is claiming to Ben that he thinks he's dug up the reason why the Chandrian do what they do, when in the past it just seems to be this like sudden, I think Ben described it as Chandrian come like lightning from a clear blue sky, just destruction, no rhyme or reason to it. And he goes, my song will have both, which is kind of funny. And then he says, I think I've dug up their reason after all this while. I've teased it together from bits and pieces of story. That's what's so galling about all this, to have a harder part of this done and have all these small specifics giving me such trouble. And then he's not giving up his theory completely. And he's like, wait for the song to be finished, which, as we know, people have been waiting a very long time to hear this song.
Wonder what that's like. Waiting a really long time for some sort of creative work that you really care about.
Yes,
I don't know. We'll think about it. But
we'll think about it.
We'll think about it a lot, Charles. You know what's kind of interesting now? What I'm thinking about is how there's a piece about lightning described here, and then there's also a brief mention of, it could be in the forest. Quothe's parents are like, oh, if we were in that situation, we might think there's bandits in the forest, right? And the parallels are there to way later in Wise Man's Fear when Kvothe is hunting bandits in the like a forest, essentially, right? And he happens upon what many folks think is at least one of the Chandrian, and I'm pretty sure there's lightning that strikes
and
in
I'm
that
also
moment.
pretty sure in that scene where he's hunting the bandits, that's when he hears the second version of the Lackless song too.
Does he? In the second version of the Lackless song,
the one about
From
7
whom?
So it says, after Kvothe and his party of mercenaries successfully defeated the bandits led by Cinder and the Eld, they meet a group of performers on the road. A boy from the group sings him a song he's heard about the Lackless family. And that's the one about 7 things stand before the entrance to the Lackless door. Blah, 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 blah.
Interesting.
So it's all of that happens in that moment, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that it's like Rothfuss is subtly building in all of this foreshadowing. And we know, believe it or not, for anyone who doesn't know this, Rothfuss wrote all 3 books before the first one was published. Like, there's that famous quote now where he's like, oh yeah, all the books are done, so yeah, I'm editing them or whatever. But we won't end up in a situation like with A Song of Ice and Fire where everyone's waiting forever for the books to be published. And of course that quote has obviously I'm paraphrasing
haunted
it,
him.
but that has come back to bite him in the ass when things have ended up the way they have. But it is the kind of thing where then again, we talked about the like blog posts that George R. Martin wrote that was like, I really wish I could have been in a situation to write all of these books before I published any of them, because it gives you the opportunity to go back and fix things that you foreshadowed and add things later. That it's like, so Rothfuss did have something resembling that opportunity, and you do see it playing out in these kind of moments where he's like, what if I just kind of throw an allusion to bandits or to lightning? And then we have that moment with Cinder and the bandits that it's like where lightning strikes and you're like, whoa, that's pretty cool. But then again, there's always other things I'm sure Rothfuss built into foreshadowing. There's like, oh, geez, this doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, and we know Rothfuss is a serial editor, and he's probably rewritten these books 100 times, and that's part of what makes like the prose and these layered moments where we're building lore and we're developing a theme, and we've got this witty dialogue all in one scene. And so I think the only way you can really achieve that is through that detail and refinement. So it's what makes the deep dive of these super fun. But yeah, it's they also kind of decode like, oh, all these signs could be like signs of different Chandrian. So we're getting trained to kind of decode stories and not necessarily accept them as straight up face value facts, and more to kind of see the context and the clues and dig at the truth through storytelling, which, you know, is a huge theme in the series. So that's the Chandrian clues that we get in this section. I guess, like, the next, where do we want to go next? Because there's this interesting moment with the Chronicler and Bast that happens.
Yeah, that's chapter 13, right? Can I mention a last bit on 12? Which is, so Arladin, that's Quothe's dad's name, right?
I believe so.
And let me yes. So Arladin does not have red hair, right? He's described as having dark hair. So something I noticed at the end of chapter 12 is like they're having this kind of playful back and forth, Quothe's parents and his mom says, come to think of it, there was a night about a dozen years ago. A man came to me. He bound me with kisses and chords of chorded song. He robbed me of my virtue and stole me away. She paused. But he didn't have red hair. Couldn't be him. Referring to... so it's referring to a, like, theoretical... her having an affair with someone else. A wandering god is what Arladin says. Like, how about it, woman? Did you happen to bed down with some wandering god a dozen years ago? That might solve our little mystery. The mystery being, like, why is Kvothe so amazing at everything?
Right.
And so she says, okay, like, someone did, steal me away, blah, blah, blah. That's the whole idea of Arladin stealing her away from her noble family and all this stuff. She runs away, joins the Edema Ruh, but she says this bit about he didn't have red hair. Is there something there where maybe she did, like, Kvothe's parentage is not Arladin, or at least his biological dad might not be Arladin. So again, all this stuff, where's it going? I don't know, but could be something there. Red hair is not common. To get red hair from two dark-haired parents.
I believe it's a recessive trait, so, you'd have to... It's statistically highly unlikely. So, I didn't do the Punnett square or anything, but, yeah.
We'll get the square out later.
We'll have to figure that out, if they both have the recessive gene or something, if it's even possible. I don't know.
You should know. There's a lot of... there's some red hair floating around in your family, right, Charles?
A little. I don't know though, but certainly not Kvothe levels. There's no Kvothes walking around.
There's some, like, orange tint to some hair in your family.
There's some speckling,
right? But not fire red like Kvothe.
Yeah,
but
not touched by fire. Is that what they say in Game of Thrones?
I believe they do. Yeah, about, like,
red-haired people.
Yeah, what was her name? Like, in the like
Malisong.
The wildling Ygritte.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, Ygritte, Ygrette.
She was, like, touched by fire.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh. All right. Shall we? So he wasn't quite touched by fire, but he was touched by iron, or at least, like, the word iron. Bast in the interlude here. So this is Bast is eavesdropping on the conversation here. We learn later, like, way after this, that I think Bast was the one who, like, brought Chronicler here. I believe we learned that, like, Wise Man's Fear. Mm-hmm. But he knows what's going on, and he is basically trying to see it play out. And then we get this moment where Chronicler, I guess he calls the name of Iron. So right? That's what happened, right? He just said Iron. His voice.
Right. He was, like, setting up a defense against Bast.
Yeah. So that's kind of, and Bast we know is sensitive to iron because of his Fey heritage. So we get that. We learn a little bit about Chronicler that he's able to do that. And we also see from Kvothe does also say something about how Bast has been alive, like, over 100 years or something like that, which is kind of interesting. From some folks think that Bast is, like, Kvothe's son in some way, or, like, so I don't know. That makes it less likely.
Yeah, it's. I kind of forgot that this scene had happened in my first read through. I was like, I thought Bast's origins were a bit more mysterious than I remember, but it's pretty much explicitly spelled out here that there's more to Bast than meets the eye. And Chronicler kind of catches on to it pretty immediately, which is also interesting. So, it kind of brings to me like, how does Chronicler know all this stuff? I don't know. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. It is interesting. Did Chronicler go to the university? Is that revealed in some way here? I'm trying to remember.
I don't know. Let's see. The Chronicler.
I bet we could find that on like the wiki or something. While you're looking at that, I'll just say that
he's a member of the Arcanum.
Yeah.
And one of a handful of people to know the true name of Iron.
Yeah. All right, so we learn Chronicler is more than meets the eye as well then, in the sense that he's able to name things, which is very advanced magic, and he's also able to pick up on like, okay, there's something up with that guy, I bet he's Fae. Like, that's a lot for a guy who's kind of presented at first as just like, oh, he's a really good story chronicler, for lack of a
shorthand and all this other stuff.
So that's interesting. And you said Bast's origins are pretty much spelled out. We have here this quote where he's getting introduced to Chronicler, and Kvothe says, "Chronicler, I would like you to meet Bastus, son of Remen, Prince of Twilight, and the Telwyth Male." Mael, the brightest, which is to say the only student I've had the misfortune to teach, glamour, bartender, and not last, my friend, who over the course of 150 years of life, not to mention nearly 2 years of my personal tutelage, has managed to avoid learning a few important facts. The first being this: attacking a member of the Arcanum skilled enough to make a binding of iron is foolish. So that's a lot just very explicitly stated about Bast, who his parent is. Again, you can do all sorts of picking apart and be like, what if Kvothe is the Prince of Twilight or whatever? But,
right.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't
think that it's just interesting.
And
we know that there's more contention between Chronicler and Bast as the story goes on, and Bast is trying to manipulate Chronicler, and this is just kind of the start of them like butting heads, coming from this like, oh my gosh, Bast is some sort of fey demon like creature, Chronicler, and their first thing is like attacking each other. So it's an interesting dynamic, but not much more than that in these early chapters. Then we've got like in the last couple chapters here, 14 and 15.
Well, it's the title track, Charles.
It is the title track. We've got the name of the wind, chapter 14.
Yeah, the chapter is called The Name of the Wind and The Name of the Wind. It's like, I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. Like, let's see. Like
Bad
any album that has like there's so many of them.
right. So it's like with Bad Company, at least it's the band name, there's an album, and there's a song, and they're all on the same album. Like the album Bad Company has the track Bad Company by the band Bad Company. Right. So it's a big deal. It's not nothing. It's like, well, that song better be really good, you'd think, right? So here we are with the name of it's a good song. Yeah. It's not their best song, but it's very good.
Okay, well that's good to hear. Or I just saw Green Day in concert, American Idiot off of American Idiot. Right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that's a good one. Song. Yeah. So, is this a great chapter? Let's find out. I do think this is a very interesting chapter because I think this also connects to some of the larger themes of the Kingkiller Chronicle. So, just starting with what happens. Kvothe tries to use sympathy which is like this logical hard magic system, to call the name of the wind, which comes from the soft magic system of naming. That's kind of more like, okay, the name of the wind's always changing. You kind of more have to like feel it in the right moment, and that's when you can call it. And I think there's a big theme in the Kingkiller Chronicle of Kvothe like overthinking things, trusting his logic, and then heading into things that would actually be better served by just following his gut and his intuition, and oftentimes his like attempts to do things in a very logical manner ends up getting him into trouble, where it's like, dude, if you just trusted your intuition, things would be a lot better. And this is kind of one of the peak moments of that, where it's like Kvothe tries to apply a like hard magic system, a logic related thing to like, oh, this is how I can figure out how to call the name of the wind. And instead he almost kills himself trying to do it. And it's like, dude, like name of the wind is something you just like, you feel and you just like do it. It's not something you can do this way, and this is going to screw you over. You could die trying to do it this way. So it's, I think like in that way, very important chapter for like getting at some of the themes really early on.
I agree. You know, it brings me back to like the epilogue of The Narrow Road Between Desires, which is probably the most recent published work of Patrick Rothfuss, is the epilogue to that short story from 2023. Yes. And he talks in that about storytelling, which it just like reading this chapter, it came to mind where he's talking about like the Three Little Pigs and like reading stories and how like, you know, this sometimes you put all of this hype into the end result or the ending or getting to the truth of something, and you kind of rush to that, and it takes away from the greater story, and the more noble artistic pursuit is in not necessarily decoding everything and getting that end result and having this huge ending, but it's more in the process of crafting this enrapturing story, right? So when you have Kvothe, who's in this titular chapter where he's like, I want to call the name of the wind, right? Like that's why I'm here. That's the thing I want to do. It's literally like I want to make wind move on command, which is kind of like when you boil it down to what he's trying to do, which is a huge oversimplification of sympathy and even calling the name of the wind. And when he tries to do it, he almost kills himself, and Ben is like changed in that moment. Like their relationship gets a little bit of a rift in it. And to me, that's kind of the same thing of like, here's almost a foreshadowing of where this book is going, where it's like, hey, you're trying to just jump to naming the wind and moving wind around. It's not how this works. And there's major consequences to that. So I just thought it was an interesting parallel and almost this like foreshadowing of where this series is going.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of, I love the way you put that, where it's just like control the way the wind goes is like, because we can lose track of that is what Kvothe is trying to do when he's trying to capture a name of the wind, be it through the soft magic or the hard magic system. And it's like, that is, when you say it that way, like you're trying to control the way the wind goes, it reminds you of like how ridiculous an idea that is. And I think that's all part of it for Rothfuss. That's why
that's not
the book
the part
is
where
titled The
getting
Name
yourself
of the Wind
killed for getting
like,
fascinated by going to this university. Like that's not really what it's about.
And like what the wind's like most essential essence is about, it's not being controlled. It just
Kvothe
goes
isn't
in
a
the way
sailor.
that it goes.
He's
like,
in Edema Ruh. He's like he has no use for manipulating the wind.
He's not
really.
playing Sea of Thieves, right, Charles? He is
exactly. He's not Captain Kennett sailing the high seas.
Right, he's not Captain Kennett either. So it's like, I guess, yeah, there's that aspect of like, dude, why do you even want to do this? And also there's the aspect of like, by trying to control the wind in a lot of ways, you are like trying to make the wind go against like its most essential nature. And I think like that's where you kind of see a lot of the like Ursula K. Le Guin type influence on Rothfuss, where it's like her work, like Wizard of Earthsea, focuses so much on like things are best when they are at their own like very nature, like, and the wind's very nature is to be just, there's really an expression, whatever way the wind blows, right? It just is going to go whichever way it goes. So to try to control it is kind of both a an ineffectual effort, but also like a defiance of what makes the wind so like special in itself. So
right,
it's
and also just like the consequences of it too, because there's like the quote in the titular quote in the titular chapter of the titular book, right, is Ben looked at the fire I'd laid out, then picked up a leaf, mumbled a few words, and watched a small flame flicker into life in the center of the twigs and tinder. He turned to look at me. You could kill yourself doing something as simple as that, he gave a sickly grin, or looking for the name of the wind, where he's basically warning him of, like, there's, when you brazenly charge into stuff, which we know Kvothe has yet to learn this lesson, whatever it is, whether it's, upsetting a noble heir or, whatever else he dives into that gets him in trouble, it's something so simple that can get you in this significant trouble. And I don't think even in that moment, Kvothe almost dies, I don't think he learns that lesson yet. We know he doesn't, because he makes the same mistakes in the university.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, it's like there's like a Shakespearean thing, right? To have these oftentimes really great, admirable characters, and then they have that like fatal flaw. I mean, that is something where Kvothe, we've had this conversation a million times about like, oh, is Kvothe married to blah blah. It's like Kvothe has that fatal flaw, and at least one, but this one is a huge one, which is his attempts to charge right into things without taking his time to be like figuring out what is actually the way to go about this. And I think between his inability to just trust his gut and intuition, Rothfuss like does paint Kvothe in this like, this dude is kind of like, yes, he's a genius, he's all these things, but he's also kind of a fool. And I think Ben pretty explicitly says, he's
a clever, thoughtless person is one of the most terrifying things there is.
Exactly.
Worse, I've been teaching you some dangerous things. It's just like putting a sword in your hands is kind of what he was talking about. He's like, what if we had a dangerous 6-year-old? What about a dangerous 20-year-old? What about a dangerous 20-year-old with a sword in his hands? And it's like, I see. Knowledge can be as deadly as it can be empowering.
Yes, that is for sure. And we're also learning Ben likes analogies.
He does.
He did that.
Well, they also try, and he's like, because one of the things he's like, what do you know about Lanray? And he's like, oh, you don't know. I've been moving these lessons too fast. We need to like take a step back, which is kind of interesting as well. Like, because Ben knows a lot more about the Chandrian and the Lanray and all this, and I think he's that obviously concerned, and he's not willing to give up all of the information just yet. So part of that is kind of a warning sign that we get with Kvothe's training.
Yeah. I mean, that leads well into the next chapter, which is a pretty short one, unless you have others on 14
nope.
there, Charles. But
let's move on.
It's called Distractions and Farewells. The crux of what actually happens in this chapter is basically they're throwing Ben a like going away party, and probably the chief thing of importance that happens is that we do get a little bit of the song. We get.
I thought it was Shandi offering to do a special dance for Ben. Was the that was the moment that stuck out
to you, Charles.
Yeah.
But
that's what the chapter was about, right? Distractions and farewells is what.
That was probably a distraction, but The bit we get of the song, I'll just read it. Sit and listen all, for I will sing a story wrought and forgotten in a time old and gone. A story of a man, proud Lanray, strong as the spring, steel of the sword he had at ready hand. Hear how he fought, fell, and rose again, to fall again, under shadow falling then. Love felled him, love for native land, and love of his wife Lyra, at whose calling some say he rose through doors of death, to speak her name as his first reborn breath. This is another one that it's like hard to decipher what is the truth in this myth. Something is. I think like every time we get a piece of like these kind of important stories, there's probably a little bit in each one that is important to pay attention to, but it's unclear what it is, and it's probably surrounded by other stuff that's not accurate, because not every version of the Lanray story we get could be accurate because they vary so much. So it's like, I don't know what to take from it, but it's important.
It is important. Yeah, I mean it's the only bit of the song that we get. So I didn't get too much out of it. I mean and I think that's kind of on purpose. It's like he's only just he didn't really want to do it, and so he's only giving away this little bit that doesn't really have much implication into what he's doing. But he is basically saying about he has figured out this story about Lanray, and I think that's kind of the biggest piece. Something we also didn't talk about was we get waystones. Which, just a quick shout out to those, where they're traditions for troops that's where they take breaks. But then it's like, waystones, gray stones, draw stones, loading stones, they're all kind of the same thing, and they may lead you into Fae and all these other things. And we know Kvothe called his inn the Waystone Inn, so it could mean one, that it's an acknowledgement of his roots as an Edema Ruh, but then also acknowledge his connection with the Fae as well. So just kind of an interesting little shout out there. But I think between those couple things, that's kind of the crux of our chapter cluster here.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one to bring up, Charles. Also the idea that a waystone is not the end, but actually a respite, like a break. So one would theoretically move again.
Smart man.
After the taking a break at the Waystone or the Waystone Inn. And I mean, that fits well with
time as a barkeep. Yeah, clever.
Yeah. And I mean, it speaks to what Rothfuss has said himself. We'll see if this comes to pass, but he's claimed that he's tricked people into reading a 3,000 page prologue in terms of the entire Kingkiller Chronicle, and that eventually something later would come that might be like Kvothe in the Frame story. I mean, it's hard to have too much faith in where any of that's going right now, but for obvious reasons with the delay and even finishing this first trilogy. But all that being said, most signs point to this is a break for Kvothe rather than a final place of resting. But it's he also gets the book from Ben that tells him it's rhetoric and logic, and I believe that plays a role in him getting into the university, and it's Ben basically saying do well at the university. Says it's interesting, remember your father's song, be wary of folly, and I'll also say there's the sword, right, named Folly, if I'm remembering correctly, so there might be something there. We won't analyze that deeply right now, but
I'm sure Kvothe
there's also
named, Kvothe's tale is tragic, right? So I'm sure he named it kind of ironically about himself.
Yeah, that maybe he was not wary of folly as Ben asked him to be. But I think just the last bit is whatever was said in that Lanray song was enough to piss the Chandrian off enough to kill everyone. So
right.
There's something there. What is it? Well, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out one day, but
one day.
Yeah. But for today, Charles, I think we've done what we can here. And
I think so.
I think it's probably time to get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping.
Let's do it. Thank you, everyone, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. Now, if you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, one of the best ways to do that is over on the socials, following us and engaging with us over there. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and TikTok, and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than following us and engaging with us over on the socials, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify, where most of you are listening. Just click about, click where the stars are, and you know how many of those to give us. You can also rate and review on Apple Podcasts. That means you can write nice things about us. You can also write your own theories about Name of the Wind, where any of this is going. Give your comments, just as long as you throw 5 stars in that, in whatever you say, we're happy. Also, follow or subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. That helps us a lot, and you'll get those episodes right in your feed instead of having to seek them out. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Well said, Dylan. Just listening, so much more than enough. Thank you all for making it to the end. Thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.